Sven, welcome to Aim to Next Digital. It's a pleasure having you. Let's start off with an introduction.
Great to be with you, Stefan. I work with McKinsey. I lead our Global Institute, which is our think tank. The think tank works on topics in a different way maybe than the normal think tanks. We work micro to macro. So for example, when it's an energy topic, we can leverage the 3,000 people in the firm that work on energy and basically work from the micro of a particular power plant and then all power plants to see how the market works rather than a top-down estimate using markets. And that provides additional insight on topics from energy to productivity to labor markets to talent markets. And I'm happy to share some of our thinking from that.
Awesome. No, I'm definitely looking forward to that. We are going to double click on a couple of those topics that you already highlighted. Let's start off with your perspective on economic growth 2024, 2025. What are you seeing and what can we expect this year and beyond?
Yeah, it's interesting. At the moment, I think there are two perspectives on where the world is and where it's heading. I would say in the microscope, the list of issues that companies and CEOs are facing, but societies at large, is very long and very differentiated. People are concerned about geopolitics, but they're also concerned about politics. You know, what happens in each country in the elections, in the largest election year. We have wars, we have supply chain disruption, we have high interest rates, we have labor shortages. And I can make this list quite long and then double click because geopolitics has many dimensions and so on. And it's actually unique, we think, how long this list is now. If you take the last 30 years, besides your normal business issues, you might have one other issue. But we were globalizing and so on. And I think we are heading into what we call a new era at this moment in time. And that's why this list of issues is so long. It has a lot to do with supply chains, because when supply chains are short, there's space for geopolitics. If supply is abundant, geopolitics much less. In the long term, you can see actually an unbelievable possibility of abundance. I think we'll have so many forms of new energy that we will have maybe cheap and abundant energy, which means the world can go round because the world go round on energy. Number two, we have enough materials in the ground, if we just look for it, to support at least 10 billion people. So there is no material limit on that side. And then we're also going through the automation AI event that produces the largest possibility for productivity increase that we've ever seen, easily doubling productivity in 20 to 30 years, which should supply long-term economic growth. But the marriage between the short-term and the long-term issues actually puts a lot of uncertainty into 24, 25, because at the moment the tight labor market is inflationary, the government spending is inflationary, the defense spending is inflationary, the energy spending is inflationary, and it's actually all high demand in a context of supply disruptions. And so that would say, okay, we are like GDP growth in the US is north of 3, Europe is of course lagging, India is on a tear, China is a little bit lower, but my potential accelerates. And so the sum total of that is actually not a clear picture this time. And that's why last year were discussing soft landing, hard landing, and we're not landing, actually we're still flying. But you could imagine 2 or 3 triggers that would lower it against the long-term context that will heighten all the growth. And that is, if the automation actually leads to a change in the job markets, where all of a sudden there will be layoffs, and the consumer starts to get nervous and not spend. And the other one is if there would be a disruption on government spending, which is supporting the economy. So I'd love to just predict, but I think we're bumbling through at the moment, and that will fuel the 24, 25. The trigger events that would get you to the lift is, are we connecting to the abundance? The trigger event of a consumer or a government. But we should add another geopolitical event. If the Suez closes, rather than just be significantly reduced, that will create shocks and inflation and so on, because we don't have capacity in the system anymore. And the same thing could happen on the energy market. So I think we are living in a strange bumbling where the events can ricochet. That's why the stock markets are quite good in many times and then volatile and so on. So it's interesting times.
It is. Now, in this environment, where will CEOs focus on in terms of prioritization of their investment strategies, and how would that determine whether they will win in the market or not?
So first of all, they are grappling with this long list. You know, if I take Davos as a measurement, I'm not saying Davos is the best measurement, but in Davos, normally over the last 7 years, one issue would have emerged. It was climate in a few of them. It was Ukraine, or it was COVID. Last year, it was soft landing or not, and Gen AI, because that was sort of launched there. But it was like two topics. Now the CEOs were actually checking whether their list was complete. Okay, oh shit, that one too, you know. What? Oh, ocean cables, we should look at that, you know. And so they were just expanding their list while they were dealing with their business issues. What is obvious from all of this is that productivity, everybody's working on, you know, and that's whether it's with automation or classical forms of productivity, because that makes you resilient no matter what. I think with a bit of a midterm view, people are reorienting their footprint and supply chain setups we won't be able to regionalize, we could talk about that later, but I think that's one thing that people are working on. They're still, you know, digitizing and so on. And they are trying to say, where do I put my money for growth? And, you know, there's more growth in North America, there's more growth in emerging markets. Will the emerging market growth be hard currency or not? Or can you at least monetize it in the right way? And so you get resource allocation also high on the agenda.
Interesting. Now, talking about productivity, you recently published some research on economic stagnation or productivity-driven abundance. Yeah. What was the main thesis and outcome of that research?
So we fundamentally believe that the productivity-led abundance is possible. We've done the work on AI plus Gen AI plus automation. We should always be a little careful that we're now thinking Gen AI is everything. Mm-hmm. Gen AI lifted the total AI potential by about 1/3. But there was classical AI already at work. But then we forget that it's not just the software. If you just go where you're close to Schiphol, if you go through the border, there's now 1 or 2 agents with 10 gates. That is a bit of hardware, it's a bit of software, and it's people. The people are actually different because now you have to have people that can repair the gates. In addition to the border control agents. To me, that's an example of automation, where you go 10 lanes, maybe with 2 people, so that's a 5 times productivity in a growth segment, which is a good thing. Fundamentally, if you add it all up, the world does about 2,200 tasks. Each job has many tasks. We found that 50% of the task work can be automated with available technology somewhere as a midpoint in 2030, 2035. But whether we will do it fast or slow is the difference between productivity growth of 0.3, which is close to stagnation, or productivity growth of 3% per annum. I believe the 3% per annum is possible, but then we cannot move in the world of pilots. We will have to do end-to-end use cases. We have to do it at scale across the waterfront of cases. And then we can get there. Now, the good thing is labor is so short that the incentives to invest in automation have never been higher. It's an interesting question because people say interest rates should drive disincentives to invest because the CapEx gets expensive. The reality is the CapEx bill is smaller than the wage bill. So inflation working on the wage bill is far more expensive than interest rates working on the CapEx bill. So as long as the CapEx is working towards automating to deal with the labor shortage, you actually are going to be in the right balance. So it's a strange thing. On the high interest rates, never been better to invest.
Interesting. Now let's double click on Europe. You also published some research on accelerating growth in Europe and remaining competitive. What's your perspective?
So, you know, already for the last 30 years, Warren Buffett would say there's the 1% growth handicap of Europe that comes a bit from productivity and less population growth. If you translate what's in the expectations of the growth of companies, publicly listed companies in Europe, it's about 1% slower than the average in the US and also slower than China, Asia. And to some degree, that's not just demographics and productivity. We are facing competitiveness issues. And there's 4 factors to remember. So 1 point growth less is the result. It's R&D spending of the publicly listed companies in Europe is half that of the US, 3 points lower on the sales. Return on capital is 300 basis points lower. Europe just makes cost of capital on average, and the US makes a premium. which means that if you sit in a boardroom, you're going to allocate money away. On top of that, in Europe, our regulation on average is regulation with a stick. It says, by 2030, you shall do this. And the regulation in the US has some of that. But if you take the IRA as an example, that's more, I give you money if you achieve this. And you can look at what the incentive difference is. And it was a little bit of an eye-opener for Europe, how fast the capital on battery factories, on hydrogen and so on, just moved to the US because of the difference of the regulation. And I think for Europe to stay competitive, it has to realize that profitability of companies is one of the decision factors on where the money will go. And so the tendency in Europe to do regulation with the stick, which makes costs go up, and the tendency to sort of say we have lower prices is the best answer rather than higher return on capital, which leads to more investment to then to innovation, on average makes Europe less competitive. And I will just add, on the energy side, we are very strict, the most strict large region on the policy, but as a result our electricity prices, for example, or other energy prices are quite high. We're also dependent, and we just had to go through the Ukraine event. If your energy prices are too high, you're just uncompetitive. So we, in our report, for example, says for electricity, prices might have to drop by a factor 2 or 3 for us to be competitive in chemicals, in fertilizer, and a couple of other things that are important to the autonomy of Europe. So Europe will have to find a way, which I think is being discussed around the new commission coming in, a different way to progress than the current model, because the current model will lead to capital flight.
No, and that's interesting. Let's double click on the regulators. You already referred to the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. Europe is trying to figure out what to do. What would you advise Europe when it relates to, the regulatory investments or policies that they can implement to accelerate the growth?
Yeah, so I think there has been a quite strong response to the IRA because it was so clear what happened, with the lots of capital moving so fast. So I think Europe has mobilized the money. They couldn't do it at the European level because Europe doesn't have a budget. So they allowed the countries to do it, which has one problem. Europe's investments landscape is already more fragmented than the US. So we might get additional fragmentation, which is not ideal. Now, I'm sure that people now read into me that we should have a federal budget. To me, the biggest shift is from stick to innovation. And what we do with the stick is actually a subtle shift underneath that still. With the stick, you force deployment, including deployment of technologies that are very expensive, before you know whether they are in the money and before you know whether they can actually be competitive in deployment. Whereas if you do innovation with a carrot, i.e. spending money more on innovation, the R&D will go up, and you wait until the innovation brings the cost down to then force. And I think, in a way, the framework by which we, for example, in the energy transition need to think, has to move from a singular goal of transition to what we call a quadrilemma. The quadrilemma is energy transition, affordability, and I would say basically same price of the old oil and gas in 2019, not carbon prices, because people can't pay for it. Security of supply, which is like, are you not too dependent? Reliability of the energy supply from an intraday perspective, but also a transition mechanism and regulation that allows for a healthy industry. And I would say I would not take any regulation that doesn't satisfy all four.
Very interesting. Now, maybe can you give an example of one of those technologies where you're saying in Europe we kind of forced to implement that expensive technology while we should actually think about innovation differently?
So let's start with a cheap technology. So wind, which is intermittent, producing electricity to a heat battery that then goes into an already installed communal heating, actually is very cheap because the intermittency gets solved by a very cheap battery. But if your wind energy is actually producing intermittency on a non-stable grid without storage or enough base load, it's going to increase the energy price. So we need to be, it's actually quite micro, and by market it will be different. This thing is different in Norway where there's a lot of hydro versus Spain where there's a lot of sun. And unilateral solutions, I don't think, even on the distance inside Europe, don't work. It's far more almost local if you want to do that. And I think you need to just mentally go away from the idea that the carbon price will be $200 because that's or euros, that's too expensive. I kind of think people could swallow in the rich world, and I mean now the poorer people in the rich world, could swallow $20 a ton or euros a ton, but 200 won't work. So we just say you cannot force deployment of technologies. Hydrogen currently is not in the money. Carbon capture and storage is not in the money. It might be or it might not. We don't know yet. But to force it now, because you say it's $60 or $200, the carbon price is 200. You're forcing it at a carbon price, which I understand why people force the 200, because that would make all these technologies possible. But that makes the energy price impossible. And just to give a simulation of what happened, when Ukraine happened, the energy price went up and politicians actually had to react with subsidies on energy because the people couldn't afford it. And that would have led to real political events. And to me, I think we are actually real life has taught us in this moment what price of energy can be borne by even the rich Western world in Europe or in the US. And as a result, I think we are resetting this to what I think is this quarter dilemma.
Interesting. Let's pivot back to global supply chains.
Yep.
What are some of the trends that you're observing? You know, we see regionalization. There's a lot of other trends. So what's your perspective on how will global supply chains evolve?
Yeah. So I think we should separate two things, which is globalization of ideology and political ideas, and just the global nature of supply chains. I'm going to talk about the second, but sometimes these things get mixed. Like globalization is like one system, one government, you know, all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to spend much time on it, but the ization almost sounds like an ideology. What we actually did over the last 30 years is to globalize product flows, trade flows, material flows, to basically give every region in the world access to what is not in their regions. As a result, the idea that the world would be able to not have global trade flows, global material flows, is mute. We've looked at this in a 300-page report for every flow in the world. The reality is the world cannot regionalize. There's no region that can be independent. One region needs rare earths from the other, one needs materials for the other, and one needs oil or gas from the other, one needs production facility and labor from the other, and it's not working. Now, what I think also happened, which is unhealthy, is that we went to dependencies on certain components or materials and so on, to all the way like 80-90% inter-regional dependency. And even if you assume goodwill of people, in bad times, 90% leads to geopolitical power. And I think, you know, it was true in the 70s. We were 50% dependent on OPEC, and in the late 80s turned to 30, and that stabilized that game a little bit. So I think 30% dependency, well designed, is a possibility, but 90% dependency is very hard. And we have too many spots where the 90% dependency exists. And one thing is also useful in this discussion, of course, China comes up all the time. China is the largest production site in the world. It is actually not the largest source. They had to do all their sourcing in all countries to get the flow into China to then produce for the world. So China is very dependent on imports for the base load that then gets converted through processing and production into products that we use. And that interdependency, I think the interdependency in general, but this one in particular also, is good because it provides some stability. Because if the interdependency is too low, you also don't have an exchange. So all of that happens. So what I see many people do is first understand where the supply chain is, which they don't know, certainly not at tier 3 and tier 4, what their dependencies are, and reorient. So as a result, you saw Mexico becoming the largest partner of the US. Might shift again this year, but it's pretty tight now with China. And I think people are trying to figure out, how can I get a not so dependent while still have the benefits of specialization and scale?
Well, thanks for sharing that insight. Back to the energy transition, and also Europe itself has a lot of very capital-intensive industries.
Yep.
How can they remain competitive in the environment that you talked about?
I think Europe needs to make first a choice. You could say for all these capital-intensive industries, we'll just depend on somebody else. I think the moment you do that, you've given up autonomy. It's it's not for me to choose, but it's a profound political choice. If you decide we can do without capital-intensive chemical, petrochemical, fertilizer, steel, and so on. If you don't have it, you have no. It's not possible to be sovereign without that industrial base. So let's assume that you're hearing in this. It might be important. The first thing we need to fix is that the energy inputs to this industry is competitive. If it's not, they cannot sustain because the consumers will not yet pay for these higher prices. It's important to realize how many consumers cannot pay for this. 4.1 billion people live above the poverty line, but below what we call the empowerment line, which is $12 a day, in which you have basic shelter, basic food, basic healthcare, and basic education. Until you're above having that, you cannot mentally even process environmental issues and so on. And not because it's not important, they're just not ready for it. And I think we need to just be careful that we think you can, and in Europe you have 20% of the population that has that problem still, a bit unbalanced by geography. The idea that you can just raise the price and it'll all be fine, I think we're learning doesn't work. So we will have to find affordable energy to maintain these industries. And again, that's why I made the remark. Ideally, we work on energy solutions that actually are more closer to $20. Now, you might say that's not possible. And then climate will override all other stories. We wrote a report for COP28 that suggests if you do the cheaper energy transition first, and then wait for the innovation curves to drive the more expensive stuff down, you actually have an option to at least do 30 to 40% of the transition now at $20 a ton. That's hard work. It's actually not as easy as putting windmills and solar panels into Europe. And just to be clear, a solar panel in the Netherlands, where we're sitting here right now, is not the optimal place to put the solar panel. It would be in Spain or in the desert. So we're doing high-cost solutions right now from an ideal profile. The 30 to 40%, COP made one decision on methane. That was part of the 30 to 40%. Heat leakage and cold leakage in warm countries, process waste and food waste are 40% of the problem, which are roughly doable at $20 a ton. That means still behavioral change, recycling, and all kinds of stuff. How do you prevent food waste in the right way and so on? But it means also heat batteries rather than electrical batteries, because the heat battery is a lot cheaper. And in many process industries that has been worked on, but I think this first 40%, we just not worked on. We wrote a abatement curve 15 years ago that said this is the cheap stuff, which is actually in the money. And then we ended up doing the stuff that's not in the money without a carbon price. And so to me, we have to get that shift going. Then there is also a possibility. And that might mean people say then you compromise because you still put gas in that has a carbon. But then we wait for CCS to come down, and then we can then we can still do it. At the moment, you say, okay, we can't do gas because it has a C in it, but we don't wait for the innovation curves. And so we need that balancing mix. We need to get better at if we want this to survive. I think it's key. So we have to get to a solution that includes an energy price that's competitive.
Yeah, 100%. Last question. Obviously, O9, we are an enterprise software technology. There are obviously many others as well. What is your perspective on how will enterprise technology or enterprise software improve sort of business performance and productivity in organizations?
I think there are several factors, and we live in a unique moment with the automation stuff. The first point is there's transparency, and transparency automated, not PowerPointed. And I think in many parts to what you're working on supply chain, the transparency is at a certain level of depth, but certainly not at a complete level. And I don't mean only for whether carbon is transparent. At the parts level, tier 3, I don't think so. It's very transparent, in particular if it's very global. So the first level is transparency. Once you have transparency, you can't automate any decision or propose any decision if you don't have transparency. So to me, that's the base level. once you have transparency, you can start to say, okay, this dependency ratio, does it work, does it not? Am I actually buying from people that work in the way that I want them to work, whatever philosophy, regulation, or something you're trying to comply to? And then you can start to intervene. I believe that in the age of automation, this can start to be a base layer, the data lake, let's say, of what through automation can become more perfect planning systems, become more perfect buffering systems. So you can now simulate, if you have the transparency, supply chain shocks, and say, okay, it's great that we had low buffers and just in time all the time, which is a different optimization. But now let's put some wild shocks in there, and what do you then do? And so I think it builds up from the data to the transparency. Now I think there's a question how far can you overdo this? Because I think to some degree we start to say we have to force the transmission to the last SME in China, Congo, Australia, and whatever. I personally think that at some point will be a cost burden that we not able to bear. At the same time we want it. So there it is a balancing act. But I think it will lift the system a lot.
Awesome. And Sven, that concludes the interview here at the AIM10X. Was super insightful. Thanks for sharing your wisdom today with us. And looking forward to having you another time.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan.
Awesome.